Today's review questions are: most controversies are centered around slavery and the new territories. California's application for statehood led to a national crisis in 1849 to 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was signed into law by President Millard Fillmore. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860.
The crowd in Syracuse, New York fell silent as Reverend J.W. Logan stood to speak. Years before, Logan had escaped to freedom on his master's horse. He had gone to college and become a minister. Now his audience waited to hear what he had to say about the Fugitive Slave Act. The time has come to change the tones of submission into the tones of defiance, and to tell Mr. Fillmore and Mr. Webster, if they propose to execute this measure upon us, to send their bloodhounds. I don't respect this law, I don't fear it, I won't obey it. It outlaws me and I outlaw it. Although the Compromise of 1850 kept peace for a few years, the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act aroused deep anger in the North. It aroused new calls for an end to slavery.
Growing support for abolition. A Fugitive Slave Act had been in effect since 1793, making it a crime to help runaway enslaved persons. The new Fugitive Slave Act, passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, however, set up harsher punishments. Now anyone caught aiding fugitive slaves could be fined $1,000 and be jailed for 6 months. With the new law, slaveholders hunted fiercely for runaways, whom they thought of as valuable lost property. They sent agents, offered rewards, or traveled north themselves to hunt down those who had run away. Agents even caught free African Americans and claimed they were fugitives. Free or enslaved African Americans could not testify in their own defense to prove that they were not fugitives. Abolitionist protests. Watching fugitives being brutally seized and driven back into slavery convinced more people of the evils of slavery. Despite the penalties, many Northerners openly assisted runaways. Former slaves and freeborn African Americans worked harder than ever to help their people. Harriet Tubman, one of the best-known conductors in the Underground Railroad, began guiding runaway slaves all the way to Canada. In Ohio, Elijah Anderson led more than 1,000 enslaved African Americans to freedom between 1850 and 1855. To win support for the abolitionist movement, Frederick Douglass and others who had gained freedom spoke at meetings and church services. Some wrote their life stories known as slave narratives. One of these books, Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave, was published in 1850 by the well-known abolitionist editor William Lloyd Garrison. The book depicted the effects of slavery in the North.
Sojourner Truth, Striving for Truth. I was born a slave in Ulster County, New York. Isabella Bumfrey began when she told her story to audiences called Belle. She lived in the cellar of her master's mansion house. Born around 1797, Belle's life changed drastically when she became free in 1828 under a New York law that banned slavery. In 1843, Belle chose a new name. Sojourner Truth is my name, she said, because from this day I will walk in the light of God's truth. She began to work in the movements both for abolition and for women's rights. Sojourner Truth had never been taught to read or to write, but she spoke with wit and wisdom. In 1852, at a gathering of Ohioans, a rowdy farmer challenged her. The Constitution did not oppose slavery. Was she against the Constitution? In answer, Sojourner used an example the farmer could understand. She knew that insects called weevils had eaten that year's wheat crop in Ohio, so she described walking near a wheat farm and touching the tall, healthy-looking stalks, but finding no grain there. I says, God, what's the matter with this wheat? And he says to me, Sojourner, there's a little weevil in it. The farmer started to interrupt, but she went on, I hears talk about the Constitution and rights of man. I come up, I take hold of this Constitution. It looks mighty big, and I feel for my rights, but they not there. Then I says, God, what ails this Constitution? And you know what he says to me? Sojourner, there's a little weevil in it.
A new picture of slavery. Many of the people who read slave narratives and listen to the stories told by freed African Americans already believed in abolition. A new novel published in 1852, though, brought the cruel story of slavery to a wider audience, moving them to tears and anger. Harriet Beecher Stowe came from a family of well-known educators and clergy. After moving from Connecticut to Ohio, she heard stories about slavery from those escaping by the Underground Railroad. She also visited plantations in nearby Kentucky. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, Stowe used her experiences to write the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, portraying a kindly plantation family with a brutal overseer, Simon Legree, and a saintly enslaved man, Uncle Tom. First printed as a series in an abolitionist newspaper, Uncle Tom's Cabin came out as a book in 1852. In the first week, it sold 10,000 copies. Later, it was reprinted in 37 languages, sold more than 1 million copies in the British Empire, and became a hit play. While Stowe portrayed some Southerners' sympathy, her description of a suffering slave and heartless slaveholder swayed more Northerners than ever against slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin also turned Southerners against the North. In the South Carolina, Mary Chestnut spoke for many slaveholders when she complained in her diary about Stowe and other Northern abolitionists. She believed that they did not know what they were talking about. Their anti-slavery opinions, she said, were an obsession with other decent people's customs and a self-serving way to make money.
Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, the political truce over slavery ended with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Senator Stephen A. Douglass of Illinois proposed the act to set up territorial governments in the Nebraska Territory and to encourage rapid settlement of the region. Douglass and other northern leaders also hoped to build a transcontinental railroad through their states rather than through the southern parts of the country. The Nebraska Territory stretched from Texas to Canada and from Missouri west to the Rocky Mountains. Douglass knew that the South did not want to add another free state to the Union. He therefore proposed dividing the region into two territories, Nebraska and Kansas. In each territory, settlers would decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty. Leaders throughout the South supported the proposal. They believed slaveholders in Missouri would move across the border into Kansas. Eventually, Kansas would become a slave state. President Franklin Pierce, a Democrat elected in 1852, also supported Douglass's proposal. With the president's help, Douglass pushed the bill through Congress. Northerners became outraged. They felt betrayed. Popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, in effect, canceled the Missouri Compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the possibility of new slave states in the West, an area that had been free for more than 30 years.
Leading Kansas. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act started the race to win Kansas for one side or the other. Backers of slavery from Missouri and other slave states moved to the territory. Under popular sovereignty, they could vote for Kansas to center the Union as a slave state. To counter the pro-slavery groups, the New England Immigrant Aid Society helped Free Soilers, members of the Free Soil Party, to migrate to Kansas to vote to make it free. The settlers built the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which became a Free Soil stronghold. States also sent settlers and weapons. Anti-slavery settlers soon outnumbered pro-slavery ones. In 1855, Kansas held elections to choose its lawmakers. Hundreds of drifters known as border ruffians crossed the border from Missouri. They had harassed anti-slavery settlers in Kansas and voted illegally for a pro-slavery government. As a result, Kansas elected a pro-slavery legislature. Its members passed what Free Soilers called black laws. One law punished anti-slavery talk with 5 years in prison. Another law gave 10 years in jail to anyone caught helping escape slaves. Anti-slavery forces refused to obey the new government in Kansas. They drafted one free state constitution and elected their own representative to Congress. Violence increased. Shootings and barn burnings became common. On April 23, 1856, a pro-slavery sheriff was shot outside the town of Lawrence. Pro-slavery newspapers blamed the town's free soilers and cried for war. In May, an army of border ruffians and pro-slavery Kansans looted and burned Lawrence, killing 5 abolitionists in the process. John Brown, a fanatical abolitionist from the Northeast had come to Kansas with 5 sons to join the anti-slavery forces. When Brown heard of the murders at Lawrence, he decided to avenge the crime. On the night of May 24th, Brown and some followers murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers at a Pottawatomie Creek. More fighting and killing followed. By late 1856, more than 200 people had been killed. Americans began to call the territory Bleeding Kansas. Violence in the Senate. The violence extended to the nation's capital, where anger of the issue of slavery exploded in the Senate. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts made a long speech viciously denouncing Southern slaveholders, and Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina as supporters of the crime of slavery in Kansas. The speech enraged Butler's nephew, South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks. 2 days later, the day after the burning of Lawrence, Kansas, Brooks approached Sumner at his desk on the Senate floor and beat him with a heavy cane, splintering the wood. Bleeding and half-conscious, Sumner was helped out of the Senate. Shocked Northerners viewed the Sumner as a martyr and helped protest meetings against the violence. For some Southerners, however, Brooks became a hero. Admirers sent him more canes. One cane bore the inscription, "Hit him again." Meanwhile, in Kansas, the struggle over slavery continued. Anti-slavery settlers eventually won the fight because of their great numbers. In 1861, Kansas entered the Union as a free state.
The Dred Scott decision. During the 1850s, Southerners often criticized the federal government for treating them unfairly. In 1857, however, the Supreme Court took their side on the question of slavery and pushed the North and South further apart. In the 1830s, an Army doctor in Missouri bought an enslaved man, Dred Scott. The doctor then moved with his household to Illinois, a free state and next to Wisconsin territory, where slavery was banned by the Missouri Compromise. Later, the family returned to Missouri, where the doctor died. In 1846, Dred Scott decided to sue for freedom for himself and his family. He claimed that living in a free territory had made him a free person. With the help of the anti-slavery lawyers, Scott's case eventually reached the Supreme Court. Many of the justices, however, favored slavery. The court voted 7-2 against him. On March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered an opinion that upheld the Southerners' view that Scott had no right to sue in federal court. The court ruled against Scott because the founders of the United States did not intend for African Americans to be citizens. In addition, Scott's travels from free territory had not affected his status as a slave. Slaves were property, and said Taney, and the Fifth Amendment prohibited Congress from taking property without due process of law. He also said that the Missouri Compromise ban on slavery north of the 36-degree 30-minute line was unconstitutional because Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in the territories. In effect, the decision meant that the Constitution protected slavery. Abolishing slavery would require a constitutional amendment. Rather than settling the issue, the Dred Scott decision aroused bitterness among abolitionists and increased tensions between the North and South. Many Southerners now happily considered all territories open to slavery. Stunned, Northerners vowed to fight the decision.